Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Larry, for the introduction. I have nothing to disclose. So in this talk, I'm going to review the common knee conditions of the knee. We're going to go over some anatomy and common pathology, and then we're going to review some advanced MR imaging that they are doing currently in the study of the knee. We're going to focus on the structures, including the menisci, ligaments, tendon, and cartilage. So let's start with the menisci. As you know, the menisci anatomy is divided by anterior horn body and posterior horn, and that includes the anterior root attachment and the posterior root attachments. Here we can see a coronal view where we can see the body's segment of the menisci. We know that the menisci have an outer and an inner edge. The outer aspect of the menisci is the one that is more thicker and more vascular. So we divide them, as we know, between the medial and the lateral meniscus. The medial meniscus is always larger in morphology, and we have to account then when we describe tears. The posterior horn is always bigger than the anterior horn. The medial meniscus is, as you can see here, not only larger everything, but the posterior meniscus is also thicker. The lateral meniscus has a more clear C shape, is smaller, and the anterior horn and the posterior horn tend to be in similar shapes. We also have the discomeniscus, which is more common seen on the lateral aspect than on the medial aspect. The discomeniscoid is a congenital condition. It happens on 5% of the population. It tends to be, as I said, more commonly on the lateral aspect, and is normally asymptomatic. Few patients present with pain, clicking, snapping, and locking, and there are three types. The complete type of the discomeniscus is mostly seen like a complete, as you can see here, a complete like round structure. Then we have an incomplete, which has kind of like this appearance of 80% of coverage of the articular surface. And then we have the Grisberg variant, which is presented as a thick posterior horn with lack of the posterolateral meniscotibial attachment, and there is a prominent Grisberg ligament. So what are the pathologies that we see on the meniscus? We have degeneration and tears. Those are the main pathologies that we see in the menisci. The degeneration is presented as intrasubstance mucinous increased signal. It can be globular in appearance or more like linear increased signal. It's normally seen starting in the posterior horn, but it tends to extend into the body and anterior horn. One of the characteristics to differentiate between meniscus degeneration and meniscus tear is that there is no extension of this abnormal signal into the articular surface of the meniscus. You can see association with free edge.
Basically, because of the impact that anti-amyloid therapy, so-called disease-modifying therapies, is about to make in clinical practice, I thought this would be an important lecture for you to go home with, and it's relevant to both neuroradiologists as well as any radiologists, particularly radiologists who are responsible for gearing up to answer the demands that are coming from the community. I think there will be material here that is really worthwhile. So let's look at these opportunities and obligations that come from these amyloid therapies. And this article that my colleague Dr. Bash and I wrote on the same topic in applied radiology. Dr. Bash is really quite an expert in this particular area. She taught me everything she knows. All right, 7 million Americans suffer from Alzheimer's disease. Roughly 25% of those patients are in the early stages and are eligible for these amyloid targeting therapies, or roughly 15 million patients in the US. The prevalence of Alzheimer's disease doubles every 5 years after the age of 60, and 1 in 3 of our seniors will die of dementia. This is a major population health issue. While death from heart disease is actually going down, death from Alzheimer's disease with our aging population has increased by 145%. This posed about a $355 billion cost in the US in 2021, and it's expected to climb to $1.1 trillion by 2050. There are two different types of Alzheimer's disease. There's a familial early onset form, which is only about 5%, but the late onset form is what we're here to talk about today, the sporadic form, and that's 95%. And the primary risk factors for this are age. It's more common in females than males, and there is a strong genetic predilection. And it centers around this apolipoprotein, ApoE4. ApoE4, that allele, is the primary genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, and it is thought to lead to impaired clearance of these amyloid beta plaques. There are actually 3 different alleles, 2, 3, and 4. E3 is the most common and seen in 50% of the population, but 25% of the population carries one ApoE4 allele, heterozygous, and that increases their risk for Alzheimer's disease 3-fold. And 2 to 3% of the population carries 2, which increases their risk of Alzheimer's disease 12-fold. Actually, ApoE2 is a rare allele, and that actually is protective against Alzheimer's disease. ApoE4 is a risk factor in Alzheimer's disease, but also cerebral amyloid angiopathy, which is very much a similar disease where amyloid gets into the vessel walls and leads to a lot of bleeds. You can see that's a very common fundamental pathophysiology with Alzheimer's disease. It is actually associated with a higher risk of the complications associated with amyloid therapy, anti-amyloid therapy.
So in the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to discuss some of the basics of neuroimaging, brain and spine, 2 areas that, if injured, obviously, time is brain, time is parenchyma. So rapidly diagnosing these patients, properly triage them, and recognizing those entities that need immediate attention are extremely important. We're just going to do a quick overview of a number of categories this morning, looking at brain and spine injuries. Brain emergencies, anytime we have intracranial hemorrhage, mass effect could lead to herniation, hydrocephalus. The H is basically these need immediate attention, and acute hypoxia. Infection too is one that not necessarily within minutes, but if you ignore an intracranial infection, the outcome rapidly gets worse if not immediately treated. Now let's look at head trauma first, which is a major cause of morbidity and mortality across all age groups. In North America, there's about 7 million incidents of head trauma, and it's in kids the leading cause of death and disability. Motor vehicle accidents in industrialized countries empirically makes sense that they are the leading cause of head injuries, and up to a third of motor vehicle injuries do involve head and neck injuries. So the mechanism of the injury is going to determine the type of pathology we see. We have translational deceleration, rapid deceleration. Angular deceleration puts a different type of force on the intracranial contents. And then, of course, penetrating injury doesn't need much explanation. But the angular deceleration and the translational deceleration effects in trauma are what determine the impact on the brain. Obviously, skull fracture. But what we're more concerned about is what's going on inside the cranium, and in this case, an epidural hematoma, mass effect with subfalcine herniation here. Now, how many of you routinely review the scout images when you get a CT scan? Use that as part of your study. There's a significant number of findings that can be found, and if you think about it, if you only have just a couple percentage incidence, if we do 85 million studies in the US a year, that's 1.7 million abnormalities that might not be detected if you look at the percentage where you can see abnormalities not visible on the axial images. That can be because it's outside the field of view of the axial images, but visible on the scout, or it could be due to an in-plane